So I'd like you to get a sense of each of the 9 people that make up the Supreme Court right now. So I'm just going to introduce them to you and tell you a little bit about them. Starting with Chief Justice John Roberts. So you'll notice for each justice, I've given you a picture. I've told you the president who appointed that person to the court, what the vote was, so that's what's in parentheses, and then the year they were born. So John Roberts was appointed to be the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court by President George W. Bush in 2005. At the time that he was nominated to be Chief Justice, he had actually been nominated by George W. Bush to take the seat that would be vacated when Sandra Day O'Connor retired from her seat, which she planned to do because her husband had contracted Alzheimer's. But while they were preparing Roberts to go up to the Senate for confirmation hearings to become Associate Justice, the Chief Justice of the court at the time, William Rehnquist, passed away from cancer. So George W. Bush withdrew the nomination for Roberts to be Associate Justice and nominated him to be the Chief Justice. So this is something not a lot of people know necessarily, that the Chief Justice is not just the person who's been there the longest. You're specifically nominated by a president to become a Chief Justice. So John Roberts, before he became Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, had been serving as, among other things, in the few years before he became Chief Justice, he had been Solicitor General, which means that he argued before the Supreme Court on behalf of the government, the executive branch. He had been on the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals and had clerked for the Supreme Court, had actually clerked for the prior Chief Justice, William Rehnquist. So he, at the time he was nominated, he was the father of 2 very adorable young children and is just generally a very charming guy. The Democrats in the Senate were prepared to oppose this nomination, but then he was so charming. And during his confirmation hearings, he repeatedly said that he saw the job of a justice on the Supreme Court to be like that of a referee in a baseball game. He's just there to call balls and strikes, not to necessarily impact the outcome of the game, but just be a referee. So he's the Chief Justice, and he's considered the most senior justice, even though he has been there less than some of the people that we're about to talk about. Next up is the most senior Associate Justice, Clarence Thomas. So Clarence Thomas was nominated to be on the Supreme Court by George H.W. Bush in 1991. He was born in 1948, and he was born in Georgia, so he's actually from South Georgia, near the coast. Clarence Thomas was nominated to take the seat that would be vacated by retiring Justice Thurgood Marshall, about whom there's a terrific movie called Marshall, if you want to learn more about him. So you may know that Thurgood Marshall was the first African-American Supreme Court justice and had a long history of fighting against discrimination, including against the law school where he had been denied admission because he was himself Black. So when he decided to retire, President George H.W. Bush was under a lot of pressure to nominate another African-American to the court. And he claimed that Clarence Thomas was the most qualified person that he could find, regardless of skin color. But not even, honestly, Clarence Thomas believed that that was the case. So Clarence Thomas was known for being very conservative. He had also been on the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals. And his nomination was going to be somewhat contentious. But then, just before the Senate Judiciary Committee was ready to take a vote to recommend him for nomination by the full Senate, a confidential report that had been filed with the FBI by a former colleague of his, a woman named Anita Hill, was leaked to the press that alleged that Clarence Thomas had engaged in sexual harassment of her while they worked together at the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the EEOC, years before. So the FBI had investigated. They couldn't really find any evidence either way. And they had given this report to the Senate Judiciary Committee, which, by the way, at the time was chaired by one Joe Biden. And the Judiciary Committee said, well, we don't have any evidence, so we're just going to let this go. And so they weren't prepared to do anything. But then when it leaked to the press, there was this massive media storm. And ultimately, Anita Hill came and testified before the Senate Judiciary Committee. It was absolutely titillating testimony. People called in sick to work so they could stay home and watch Senate Judiciary Committee hearings on C-SPAN, which doesn't happen very often. Ultimately, the Senate Judiciary Committee passed on his nomination without really voting for or against. And you'll notice here the final vote was 52-48, one of the closest votes in Supreme Court confirmation history. Next up is Ruth Bader Ginsburg, sometimes known as RBG, or if you're hip to the lingo, Notorious RBG. Ruth Bader Ginsburg was appointed by Bill Clinton in 1993. And before she had this job, she worked as Solicitor General. She was on the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, and earlier in her career had sort of become known for being a tireless advocate for women's equality and women's rights at the American Civil Liberties Union, or ACLU. There's a terrific movie about one of her first cases in gender discrimination law called On the Basis of Sex that's terrific, and I highly recommend it. So Ruth Bader Ginsburg was not Clinton's first choice for this seat. His first choice was a guy named Stephen Breyer. But on the day that he came in to talk to Bill Clinton about the seat and about the nomination, Breyer had just that day or the day before had some fairly major dental work and was taking pain medication and apparently was not super coherent. So Bill Clinton passed on him in 1993 and nominated Ruth Bader Ginsburg to the court. She has really got this kind of unexpected and peculiar cult following among younger generations of women who look up to her as something of a feminist icon, and I think she would totally be okay with that. In an interview 8 or 10 years ago, someone asked her what job she would have liked to have had she not become a Supreme Court justice, and she said quite seriously, I think I would have liked to have been a diva. By which she means she wanted to be an opera diva. She's a big-time opera fan and loves to go to the opera, loves to listen to opera. That's her preferred method of music, or preferred genre of music. And so she has really quite an interesting following. She's also, as you can see, the oldest justice on the court, having been born in 1933. Next up, we have Stephen Breyer. So the next year after RBG got her seat on the court, Clinton had the opportunity to nominate another justice, and this time Stephen Breyer had not had massive dental surgery or whatever, and so he came in and made a good impression. I love this photo of him because it's exactly the way I think about him. He's always sort of using his hand like this. He does a lot of this. He's very expressive, uses his hands a lot, loves to talk, loves a good intellectual debate, loves to laugh. He was appointed by Bill Clinton in 1994, as I said. Stephen Breyer is kind of like your very non-exciting old white guy. One time I Googled interesting things about Stephen Breyer, and I got a Time magazine article that had the 10 most interesting things about Stephen Breyer. And one of them was that he likes to birdwatch and that he shops in the same grocery store that Julia Child once shopped in. And that he wanted to go to Harvard as an undergrad, but his mom was concerned that he would never meet a girl and get married if he went to a bookish place. So instead he went to Stanford to appease his mom. These are the interesting things we have about Stephen Breyer. So that's him. We fast forward 12 years and we get to Samuel Alito, who was appointed by George W. Bush in 2006. So he became the nominee and eventually the justice who took the spot that Sandra Day O'Connor vacated when she retired from the court. His nomination was a bit more controversial than was John Roberts's the year before, whereas John Roberts is a very charming guy who was very comfortable talking to the Senate Judiciary Committee. Samuel Alito is not super comfortable under scrutiny, and I think based on body language and nonverbal communication, seemed to be very uncomfortable and not exactly enjoying the whole process. So his nomination was a bit closer than was John Roberts's, but he did successfully get his spot. He was also in the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals before taking a seat on the Supreme Court. Obama's first nominee was a woman named Sonia Sotomayor. Sonia from the Bronx. She's known as Sonia from the Bronx. She is the first Latina on the court. Her parents are Puerto Rican and moved to the Bronx when before she was born. As a young child, she was diagnosed with juvenile diabetes and was told by her doctor that she probably wouldn't live to be an adult. But as you can see, she's still alive and still on the court. She was serving on the Second Circuit Court of Appeals before she got this job. She still goes back to the Bronx and goes back to her neighborhood, and the people there know her well. She's known as being pretty tough on crime. She was a district attorney in New York before she went into the federal court system. And she's really, really tough when it comes to crime and when it comes to thinking about civil liberties and those sorts of things. Justice Elena Kagan is Obama's second nominee to the court. She joined the court in 2010. Before she got this job, she was the Solicitor General, so she argued for the Obama administration before the Supreme Court. And before that, she was the Dean of the Harvard Law School. But interestingly enough, Justice Kagan is the only person on the court right now, and the only one that I can think of in recent history anyway, who had never been a judge before she became a justice on the Supreme Court. So she wasn't on a circuit court of appeals. She wasn't a trial court judge at any point. And that was somewhat controversial when she was nominated. The Republicans in the Senate especially were very concerned about her lack of judicial experience, notwithstanding the fact that she had argued before the Supreme Court. But much like her Chief Justice, John Roberts, she was incredibly charming during her confirmation hearings. There's a great video of Lindsey Graham asking her about where she was on Christmas, and there's a great joke in there. Go find it. It's about a minute-long video. It's quite funny. But she was just having the time of her lives. Like, it was clear that she would have sat at that desk and answered questions from senators for days and days and days longer than she did. She just loved the intellectual exercise of being asked questions and talking about the law. So it was hard to argue that she didn't have the temperament or the knowledge to do the job, even though she had never been a judge before. Next up is Neil Gorsuch, who was nominated by Donald Trump in 2017 and took the court then. Neil Gorsuch, in his own right, is certainly qualified to be a Supreme Court justice. He had served on the Circuit Court of Appeals in Colorado before he got this job and had a long history of serving on the court. He had clerked for a Supreme Court justice, I think Anthony Kennedy, before he got this job, he got this nomination. But the thing about Neil Gorsuch is that he'll always have a little bit of an asterisk after his name, because he took the seat that was vacated in February of 2016 when former Associate Justice Antonin Scalia passed away unexpectedly. So February of 2016 is February of an election year. And at the time that he passed away, Barack Obama was president, and Obama nominated a rather moderate federal judge from the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals named... oh my gosh, his name just flew right out of my head, Merrick Garland, to take the seat. So Merrick Garland was very well respected. He had been unanimously confirmed to his seat on the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals by the exact same Senate that was asked to consider his nomination for the Supreme Court. So he's well liked by both Democrats and Republicans, and as I said, was quite moderate. But the Senate Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell, said, we're not interested in confirming an Obama nominee to the Supreme Court during an election year. So we're going to hold the seat open until after the 2016 election, 10 months away. And so that left a seat open for an entire calendar year, at which point Donald Trump nominated Neil Gorsuch to take the seat. I feel bad for Gorsuch because, as I said, he's perfectly qualified to have the seat and probably would have been well received had it not been under this cloud of deep partisan disagreement over the seat. But he, as the picture here indicates, can be rather likable when he's answering questions and was confirmed. The most recent addition to the court is Associate Justice Brett Kavanaugh, who was nominated by Donald Trump in 2018. So remember when I showed you Clarence Thomas, his final confirmation vote was 52-48. Here we've got 50-48 because there are a couple of seats that were vacant at the time that Kavanaugh came up for confirmation. So Brett Kavanaugh, much like Clarence Thomas before him, was alleged to have engaged in some potential sexual misconduct. This was an allegation that came from a high school party that he had maybe had not been to. A woman named Christine Blasey Ford came forward with a report of what had happened to her at that party. She testified before the Senate Judiciary Committee. Brett Kavanaugh responded. It was a very emotional day of testimony, and one that with the students who watched that with me in the morning and saw Christine Blasey Ford testify, all said they felt like she was believable, she was credible, and they were sympathetic to her. In the afternoon, when we watched, a different group of students watched Brett Kavanaugh's response, they all felt like he was justified in his anger about this baseless allegation. It was really interesting. Depending on who you saw, you could have been persuaded by either one. But ultimately, there was no real resolution. There was no protracted FBI investigation into these allegations. They didn't go back and talk to some of the witnesses that Christine Blasey Ford said were there. They rushed it through for better or worse, and Brett Kavanaugh got his seat. He had served on the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals prior to getting this seat and had also clerked for Anthony Kennedy, which was the justice that he replaced. So he's the most recent addition to the court. And those are our 9 justices. I've only told you a little bit of what I have to say about them, and this video is already about 18 minutes long, so I will stop. But just to say that each of them has a really interesting background, and I encourage you to find out more about them, because these are 9 people who have tremendous impact on our government and our system of law, and it's good for us to know who they are and how they got there and what they believe.